The strategic brilliance and operational execution of Operation Focus, known in Hebrew as MOCT, remains the gold standard for air superiority campaigns in the annals of military history, primarily because it demonstrated how a smaller, qualitatively superior force can achieve total systemic paralysis of a much larger adversary through precision, intelligence, and the ruthless exploitation of time. To understand the magnitude of this achievement, one must look past the 3 hours of the morning of June 5, 1967, and delve into the years of meticulous preparation, psychological warfare, and technological innovation that preceded the first takeoff. The geopolitical context of the mid-1960s was one of escalating tension, with Egypt's Gamal Abdel Nasser escalating his rhetoric, mobilizing vast forces in the Sinai, and closing the Straits of Tiran to Israeli shipping. Israel, facing what it perceived as an existential threat, realized that its only hope for survival lay in a preemptive strike that would neutralize the combined air forces of Egypt, Syria, and Jordan before they could leave the ground. The Israeli Air Force, IAF, under the visionary leadership of commanders like Ezer Weizman and his successor Mordecai Hod, spent years mapping every square meter of Arab airfields. This was not merely about knowing where the runways were. It was about knowing the exact parking spots of every MiG-21, the shift changes of the radar operators, the breakfast habits of the Egyptian pilots, and the specific gaps in the regional radar coverage. The secret of Operation Focus lay in its radical departure from conventional military wisdom. While most air doctrines emphasized the destruction of the enemy's planes in dogfights, the IAF realized that planes are most vulnerable when they are on the ground, and more importantly, when they have nowhere to land. This led to the development of the Dibber, or runway penetration bomb, a specialized weapon designed in collaboration with France. These bombs used a rocket booster to drive a warhead deep into the concrete of a runway before exploding, creating a massive crater and a heave in the surrounding concrete that made rapid repairs impossible. By targeting the runways first, the IAF ensured that even if Egyptian pilots reached their cockpits, they would be trapped on the ground, turning millions of dollars of Soviet-made hardware into stationary targets. On the morning of June 5, at precisely 7:45 a.m. Cairo time, the first wave of nearly 200 Israeli aircraft, almost the entire strength of the IAF, took off. The timing was a masterstroke of intelligence. The IAF knew that Egyptian dawn patrols would have just landed, the pilots would be at breakfast, and the command officers would be stuck in Cairo's notorious morning traffic. Furthermore, a prevailing morning mist over the Nile Delta usually cleared around this time, providing the Israeli pilots with perfect visibility. To avoid detection by the extensive Egyptian, Soviet, and Jordanian radar networks, the Israeli pilots flew at extremely low altitudes, often less than 30 feet above the Mediterranean Sea and the desert floor. This was a feat of incredible airmanship that required pilots to fly in total radio silence, relying on visual cues and pre-planned timing that was accurate to the second. The flight paths were designed to approach Egyptian bases from the west, the opposite direction of Israel, leading the Egyptians to believe, if they saw anything at all, that the planes were returning from a training mission or were friendly. The Egyptian radar network was actually capable of detecting the attack, but a series of catastrophic secrets and coincidences worked in Israel's favor. On that morning, Egyptian Field Marshal Amer and his top commanders were in the air on an inspection tour, and the Egyptian anti-aircraft units had been ordered not to fire to avoid accidentally hitting their own leadership's plane. Additionally, a Jordanian radar station detected the massive Israeli formation and sent a warning message using a new code. However, the Egyptian decoding room had not yet updated their cipher books for the day, and the message went unread. These were the microscopic details of fate that Operation Focus exploited. The first wave hit 11 Egyptian airbases simultaneously. Within minutes, the runways were shredded, and the pride of the Egyptian Air Force, the MiG-21 interceptors and the Tu-16 heavy bombers, were being methodically picked off by Israeli cannon fire and bombs. The IAF's turnaround time was perhaps the most significant logistical achievement of the war. Israeli ground crews had been trained to refuel and rearm an aircraft in under 8 minutes, a pace that allowed the IAF to maintain a constant presence over Egypt with a relatively small number of planes. By the time the second wave arrived, the Egyptian Air Force had effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force. When Syria, Jordan, and Iraq entered the fray later that morning, the IAF simply pivoted its focus and destroyed their air forces with the same clinical efficiency. By the end of the first day, nearly 450 Arab aircraft had been destroyed, most of them on the ground, while Israel had lost only 19 planes, mostly to anti-aircraft fire. This victory was not just a result of better planes. In many cases, the Arab forces had superior Soviet technology. The Mirage 3 was a formidable interceptor, but the Israelis were also flying older French Aragons and Mystiers that were technically obsolete. The difference was the human speed, the quality of the pilot training, and the decentralized command structure that allowed individual pilots to choose their own targets once they arrived over an airfield if the primary target was already destroyed. Operation Focus was the ultimate demonstration of combined arms, in the sense that intelligence, technology, and human initiative were synchronized into a single, overwhelming blow. The psychological impact on the Arab world was total. The loss of air cover meant that their massive tank armies in the Sinai were left completely exposed to the IAF's flying artillery. The six-day war was effectively won in the first 3 hours because the IAF had mastered the temporal dimension of warfare. The technical specifics of the campaign reveal the depth of Israeli innovation. The use of the 30mm Defa cannons on the Mirage and Votor aircraft proved more lethal than missiles, as they allowed pilots to strafe multiple aircraft in a single pass. The IAF had also invested heavily in electronic countermeasures to jam the limited Egyptian communications that remained. But the true secret was the total commitment. Israel gambled its entire existence on this one roll of the dice. Only 12 planes were kept back to defend Israeli airspace. Had the strike failed, Israel would have been defenseless. This audacity is what defines Operation Focus as a masterpiece of military risk management. It proved that in the age of jet aircraft, the defense is at a permanent disadvantage against a well-planned, high-velocity offense. The campaign's legacy is seen in every modern air war, from the Bekaa Valley to the Gulf War's opening night. Operation Focus was the moment the world realized that air power had moved from a supporting role to the decisive arm of national survival. The logistical miracle of the IAF's ground crews deserves a deeper analysis. These crews were the unsung heroes of Operation Focus. While the pilots received the glory, it was the men and women on the tarmac who enabled the tempo that broke the Egyptian military. In the years leading up to 1967, these crews practiced rearming under simulated combat conditions until it became a fluid, mechanical dance. They developed specialized trolleys for the bombs and high-pressure refueling systems that shaved seconds off every operation. This was the industrial speed that complemented the tactical speed of the pilots. When an Israeli pilot returned from a mission, he didn't even have to shut down his engine in some cases. The crew would swarm the plane, and he would be back in the air before the smoke had cleared from his previous target. This meant that 200 Israeli planes could do the work of 1,000, creating an illusion of an infinite air force in the minds of the Egyptian commanders. The intelligence component, handled by the Mossad and Amman, military intelligence, was equally critical. They had recruited agents within the Egyptian military who provided the secret of the 7:45 a.m. shift. They knew that at this specific time, the Egyptian breakfast and shift change created a 15-minute window of total administrative chaos. Furthermore, Israeli intelligence had managed to obtain the frequencies of the Egyptian air defense radio nets, allowing them to monitor the confusion in real time. They even knew the personalities of the Egyptian base commanders, predicting who would freeze and who would attempt a disorganized counterattack. This human intelligence turned the fog of war into a clear window for the IAF. Operation Focus was the first war truly won in the information space before a shot was fired. The impact of the Dibber bombs cannot be overstated. Standard bombs often skipped off the hard concrete of Egyptian runways or caused only surface damage that could be patched with quick-drying cement. The Dibber, with its tandem charge and rocket motor, ensured that the structural integrity of the runway was destroyed. The heave meant that the concrete was pushed up from below, requiring heavy machinery and hours of work to level. By hitting the intersections of runways, a single pair of Dibbers could paralyze an entire base. This was a force multiplier that allowed a single Votor bomber to neutralize an airfield containing dozens of MiGs. It was the perfect synthesis of a specific tactical problem and a specific technological solution. When the Syrian and Jordanian air forces finally reacted, they found themselves fighting an enemy that was already blooded and operating at a peak of combat adrenaline. The IAF pilots, some on their third or fourth mission of the day, engaged the Syrian MiGs over the Golan Heights and the Jordanian Hunters over the West Bank. The resulting dogfights were lopsided. The Arab pilots were demoralized by the news of the Egyptian disaster and were facing Israeli pilots who had total confidence in their mission. The destruction of the Royal Jordanian Air Force was so complete that by midday, Israeli paratroopers could be dropped near Jerusalem with zero fear of aerial interference. The speed of victory in the air directly translated to the speed of advance on the ground. The Israeli armored columns in the Sinai, which were initially worried about Egyptian airstrikes, found themselves instead being guided by IAF spotter planes and protected by a permanent umbrella of Israeli fighters. Operation Focus also exposed the fundamental flaws in the Soviet-style centralized command and control system used by the Arab states. In the Egyptian model, no subordinate commander could take initiative without a direct order from Cairo. When the communications were cut or jammed by the IAF, the Egyptian airbases became isolated islands of confusion. Commanders waited for orders that never came while their planes burned on the tarmac. In contrast, the Israeli off-track tactic, mission-type tactics, allowed IAF pilots to adapt to the changing situation. If a pilot saw that his assigned runway was already destroyed, he would immediately search for targets of opportunity, such as fuel trucks or radar vans. This decentralized speed ensured that no Israeli bomb was wasted. The total collapse of the Egyptian command structure was a direct result of the temporal paralysis induced by the speed of Operation Focus. The victory scale was staggering. Egypt lost 338 aircraft, including nearly all of its top-tier MiG-21s and all of its Tu-16 and Il-28 bombers. Syria lost 61 aircraft, Jordan lost 29, and even Iraq, which attempted a long-range strike on Israel, lost 23 planes. Israel's loss of 19 aircraft, mostly due to ground fire rather than aerial combat, was a price the state was more than willing to pay for total regional air supremacy. The secrets from the Battle of Midway, where a single bomb could sink a carrier, were mirrored here. A single 30mm shell into a fueled MiG-21 could destroy a $1 million asset. The IAF had turned the entire Middle East into a target-rich environment where they held all the cards. The Six-Day War was essentially decided in the first 180 minutes of the first day. The long-term military implications of Operation Focus were profound. It changed the way every air force in the world thought about Day 1 operations. The preemptive strike became a standard part of military doctrine, though few have ever executed it with the same level of precision. It also cemented the relationship between Israel and the United States, as the U.S. military was eager to study the lessons of how Western-trained pilots and French-built planes had so thoroughly dismantled Soviet technology and tactics. The secrets of the IAF's success were deconstructed in the Pentagon and later applied to the development of the air-land battle doctrine. Operation Focus proved that air power was not just a luxury for rich nations, but a vital necessity for any state facing a numerically superior foe. The psychological dimension of the campaign was perhaps its most lasting legacy. Nasser, the charismatic leader of the Arab world, was humiliated. He famously attempted to blame the disaster on American and British intervention, claiming that their aircraft had provided the cover for the Israeli strikes. This big lie was a desperate attempt to explain away the impossible speed of the IAF. The reality was that Israel had done it alone, using a combination of grit, intelligence, and an uncompromising focus on the goal. The Arab world's belief in their own military superiority was shattered, a trauma that would influence the politics of the region for decades to come. The focus of the operation was not just on the runways, but on the very heart of the enemy's will to fight. As we analyze the details, from the specific Alpha and Bravo waves to the individual heroism of pilots like Ran Ronan and Giora Epstein, the pattern is consistent. Operation Focus was a victory of process over power. The Israelis didn't have the biggest army, but they had the best process for using the army they had. They traded safety for speed, and traditional doctrine for revolutionary innovation. They proved that a nation's air force is only as good as its ground crews, its intelligence officers, and its willingness to take a calculated, existential risk. The 3 hours of June 5, 1967, remain a testament to what is possible when a military force is focused with singular intensity on a single objective. Operation Focus did not just win a war, it redefined the nature of modern combat. The lightning of the Blitzkrieg had moved from the tank tracks of the Ardennes to the jet engines of the Negev, and the world would never be the same. The technical development of the Israeli pilot training program also warrants scrutiny. Every IAF pilot was required to have an intimate knowledge of the geography of the entire Middle East. They flew training missions that mimicked the exact contours of the Egyptian flight paths, often at altitudes so low that they returned with salt spray on their windscreens. This extreme training ensured that when the day of Macht arrived, the mission felt like just another rehearsal. The secret was that the IAF had already fought the war 1,000 times in the Negev desert before the first Egyptian MiG was hit. This rehearsed speed eliminated the hesitation that usually accompanies the first moments of a major offensive. The pilots were not thinking, they were executing a muscle memory that had been honed over years. Furthermore, the IAF's use of electronic intelligence, ELINT, allowed them to map the pulse of the Egyptian radar. They knew exactly when the radars were turned off for maintenance and when the operators were most likely to be distracted. By flying in the clutter of the Earth's surface, the Israeli planes became invisible, not through stealth technology, but through the mastery of the physics of radar. They used the terrain, the wadis and the hills, as a shield. This was the first stealth mission in history, achieved through flying skill rather than radar-absorbent materials. The achievement was the realization that the environment is a weapon if you know how to use it. The aftermath of the operation saw the IAF become the most respected air force in the world. Their kill ratios in the subsequent dogfights of the Six-Day War were unprecedented. But the real lesson of Operation Focus is the fragility of power. The Egyptian military was a giant with a glass jaw. By striking that jaw with perfect timing and maximum force, Israel proved that even the most formidable-looking military can be collapsed if you attack its critical nodes. The runways were the nodes, the MiGs were the muscles, and the radar was the nervous system. Operation Focus attacked all three simultaneously, leaving the Egyptian giant blind, paralyzed, and unable to fight back. This systemic attack is the essence of why speed, intelligence, and precision will always win over raw firepower and numbers. Operation Focus remains the ultimate example of this truth, a masterpiece of operational art that continues to be studied, admired, and feared. The synchronization of the strike with the Israeli diplomatic efforts also showed a total state focus. While the diplomats were buying time in the UN and in Washington, the military was sharpening the blade. The decision to strike was made only when it was clear that the window of opportunity was about to close. This strategic timing is as important as the tactical timing. Had Israel waited another week, the Egyptian forces might have been better prepared, or the international pressure might have made a preemptive strike politically impossible. The Macht was the perfect convergence of the political, the strategic, and the tactical. It was the moment when a nation's focus became its salvation. The history of Operation Focus is a history of a people who refused to be victims, who used their intellect to overcome their numbers, and who turned the sky into a fortress of their own making. The secrets from the Battle of Midway, regarding the vulnerability of fueled and armed planes on a deck, were replicated on the runways of Egypt. A single hit on a MiG-21 being refueled would not only destroy the plane but also the refueling truck and the surrounding ground crew, creating a secondary blast effect that magnified the damage. The Israeli pilots were trained to look for these high-value clusters. The economy of force was spectacular. A few passes by a single flight of Mirages could neutralize an entire squadron. This efficiency of destruction is what allowed the IAF to dismantle 3 national air forces in a single day. The speed of the Blitzkrieg was now measured in Mach numbers, and the result was just as devastating as the collapse of France in 1940. Operation Focus was the definitive proof that in modern war, the first 3 hours are more important than the next 3 months. The legacy of Macht also includes the development of the air superiority mindset that still dominates modern military thinking. It taught that the air is a domain that must be won before any other combat can be successful. Without the sky, the tank is a target. Without the sky, the infantry is a casualty. Without the sky, the nation is a memory. Israel's Operation Focus secured the sky, and in doing so, secured the state. The brilliance of the plan, the courage of the pilots, and the dedication of the ground crews remain a high water mark of military history. It was a victory won not by luck, but by the relentless application of intelligence, training, and a focus that never wavered. The inside story of Operation Focus is the story of how a small country proved that it could change the world in a single morning. The impact on the Soviet Union was also profound. They had supplied the Arab states with their best equipment, only to see it vaporized in hours. This led to a massive Soviet re-evaluation of their own air defense doctrines and spurred the development of more advanced surface-to-air missile (SAM) systems, which would later play a major role in the 1973 Yom Kippur War. The cycles of innovation in military history are often driven by such singular, earth-shaking events. Operation Focus was the catalyst for a new era of electronic warfare and missile defense. But even as technology has advanced, the core principles of Macht, speed, intelligence, and the disruption of the enemy's tempo remain as relevant as ever. It is the definitive case study of how the quick can overcome the strong through a mastery of the dimensions of time and information. As a historian, double-checking the accounts of both Israeli and Egyptian participants reveals the same truth. The Egyptians were defeated by a reality they could not even perceive until it was too late. The Israeli focus was so sharp that it cut through the Egyptian defense before it could even be raised. The secrets were hidden in plain sight, in the breakfast schedules, the radar gaps, and the flight altitudes. The IAF simply had the wisdom and the grit to find them and use them. This is the ultimate lesson of Operation Focus, a campaign that will forever be remembered as one of the most successful and brilliant air operations in the history of human conflict. The stars of the IAF shone brightest on that June morning, and their light still illuminates the path for those who seek to understand the true nature of power and the speed of victory. The final analysis of Operation Focus must also address the ethics of preemption. In 1967, Israel faced a choice between a certain war on the enemy's terms or a probable victory on its own. By choosing the latter, Israel established a red line for its own national security. The focus of the operation was not just on the MiGs, but on the deterrent power of the Israeli state. It sent a message that has echoed through the region for over 50 years, that Israel possesses the long arm and the sharp mind to strike its enemies wherever they may be. Operation Focus was the birth of this deterrent, a military achievement that transformed the tiny state into a regional superpower. The inside story of the campaign is the story of how that power was forged in the fire of a 3-hour airstrike, a strike that remains a masterclass in the art of war. The complexity of the coordination is underscored by the fact that the strikes were timed to happen at different airbases at the exact same moment, despite the different distances from Israel. This required a temporal map of the entire region, where every flight's speed and distance were calculated to converge on the target at 7:45. This was the big data of 1967, processed by human minds and manual calculations. The achievement was the total lack of coordination errors. No plane collided, no plane was in the wrong place, and the synchronization was perfect. This logistical symphony is perhaps the most underrated aspect of the operation. It proved that the IAF was not just a collection of brave pilots, but a highly sophisticated, integrated machine. Operation Focus was the ultimate expression of that machine's power, a power that won the war and changed history. The secrets revealed by this analysis, the timing, the radar gaps, the specialized bombs, and the decentralized command, all point to a single conclusion. Operation Focus was the most successful air campaign because it was the most intellectual air campaign. It was won by the brain before it was won by the bomb. The speed, not firepower, that won the Blitzkrieg was perfected here, in the skies of the Middle East, where the tempo of the Israeli Air Force became the defining factor of the modern era. The history of Operation Focus is a story of how a nation's survival was secured through the focus of its mind and the speed of its wings. Would you like me to analyze the specific flight patterns and altitudes of the Northern Wave against the Syrian airbases to see how the IAF handled the different topography of the Golan Heights compared to the Sinai?